The human mind possesses a remarkable, almost defiant capacity for resilience, a built-in mechanism that allows us to endure the unthinkable and emerge with the will to continue. Yet beneath the armor of survival often lies a quiet, cumulative weight, the physiological debt of a body that has spent a lifetime in a state of high alert. For decades, the world looked at Violet Jessop as the unsinkable woman, a figure of supernatural luck who walked away from the three greatest maritime disasters of the 20th century. But luck is a heavy burden to carry, and the body eventually demands a reckoning for the adrenaline it has spent. On May 5, 1971, in the quiet village of Great Ashfield, Suffolk, the silence was absolute. There were no crashing waves, no screams of a sinking leviathan, and no freezing Atlantic spray. There was only a 78-year-old woman in a modest cottage, found by a neighbor, resting in a stillness that the North Atlantic could never provide. The mystery of Violet Jessop is not how she died, but how she lived so long after the sea tried 3 times to claim her. While the public focused on the miraculous nature of her survival, a deeper investigation into her physical and psychological history reveals a woman who was perpetually braced for impact. To understand the end of her story, we must look past the headlines and into the medical reality of a life lived in the shadow of catastrophe, moving beyond the myths of the Titanic and the Britannic to find the human heart that finally quietly stopped beating. Violet Constance Jessop was born in 1887 on the pampas of Argentina, the eldest of 9 children born to Irish immigrants. Her childhood was defined not by the luxury of the ocean liners she would later inhabit, but by a proximity to death that began long before she ever stepped onto a gangplank. As a young girl, she contracted tuberculosis. The doctors of the era, lacking the antibiotics and imaging we rely on today, gave her mere months to live. They viewed her lungs as a lost cause, a landscape of infection that should have surrendered. Instead, Violet survived a recovery that her family viewed as a miracle, and which modern medicine might view as the first evidence of an exceptionally robust immune system and a stubborn innate vitality. This early brush with a wasting disease instilled in her a specific psychological architecture, the understanding that life is fragile and that survival is a matter of quiet, disciplined endurance. When her father died, the family returned to Great Britain, and the burden of support fell onto Violet's young shoulders. She followed her mother's footsteps into the world of maritime service, a profession that in the early 1900s required an almost military level of perfectionism. To be a stewardess on the great liners was to be a ghost in the machinery of luxury. Violet had to be invisible yet omnipresent, maintaining a veneer of calm, elegance regardless of the weather or the temperament of the elite passengers. This required a profound suppression of self, a psychological discipline that masked any internal anxiety. By the time she joined the crew of the Olympic, the first of the White Star Line's 3 massive sister ships, she was a woman defined by her work ethic and her ability to remain composed under pressure. In 1911, the Olympic collided with the HMS Hawk. The impact was violent. The hull was torn open, and the vibration shook the very soul of the ship. Violet was there, watching the water rush in, yet she remained at her post. She witnessed the engineering miracle of the ship staying afloat, a moment that likely reinforced a dangerous psychological comfort with the stability of these unsinkable giants. Her body processed the shock, the cortisol spiked, and then she returned to work. She did not know that this was merely the overture to a decade of trauma. When she transitioned to the Titanic in 1912, she did so with the weariness of a seasoned professional. On the night of April 14th, as the iceberg grazed the starboard side, Violet was not a passenger seeking adventure. She was an employee with a checklist. She stood on the deck, calmly demonstrating to non-English speaking passengers how to don their life belts. Her voice steady, even as the deck began to list beneath her feet. The trauma of the Titanic was not just the sinking, it was the sensory overload, the roar of the venting steam, the chilling silence of the stars, and the weight of the small, bundled baby someone thrust into her arms as she was lowered into Lifeboat 16 for 8 hours. She sat in the freezing dark, her body temperature dropping, her heart rate fluctuating in a state of acute stress. When she was finally rescued by the Carpathia, a woman, presumably the baby's mother, grabbed the child and ran without a word. The lack of closure, the suddenness of the loss, and the sheer scale of the death surrounding her would have left deep, microscopic scars on her nervous system. In the aftermath, there was no counseling, no diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, which would not be formally recognized for another 70 years. There was only the expectation to return to sea. Violet's resilience was praised, but scientifically, we must wonder about the toll of the survival reflex for a human being to experience such a catastrophic event and then return to the same environment, the open ocean. The vibrating engines, the narrow corridors requires a massive amount of psychological repression. She didn't just return. She volunteered as a nurse for the Red Cross during World War I, eventually boarding the Britannic, the third and largest of the sister ships. In 1916, in the Aegean Sea, a massive explosion ripped through the vessel. This time, the sinking was not a slow, 3-hour descent, but a violent, 21-minute plunge. As the Britannic's massive propellers rose out of the water, still spinning, they acted like industrial shredders, pulling lifeboats into their blades. Violet was forced to jump. She hit the water and was sucked under the keel, her head striking the steel hull with tremendous force. She emerged from the water with a fractured skull, a traumatic brain injury that went undiagnosed for years. She complained of headaches, but she kept working. She survived the tuberculosis of her youth, the collision of the Olympic, the freezing void of the Titanic, and now a physical blow to the brain and a near drowning on the Britannic. By her early 30s, Violet Jessop's medical history was a roadmap of extreme physiological stress. She was a woman who had mastered the art of carrying on, but the human heart and the human brain are not infinite resources. Every time she stepped back onto a ship, her sympathetic nervous system was likely in a state of hypervigilance. The perfectionism she displayed in her work was a shield, a way to control an unpredictable world. Yet as she moved into middle age, the unsinkable label began to feel less like a tribute and more like a sentence. People saw the miracle. They didn't see the chronic headaches from the skull fracture, the lingering effects of the Argentine tuberculosis on her respiratory reserves, or the silent mounting pressure on her cardiovascular system. She was a woman who had lived 3 lifetimes of terror before most people reached their prime. As she continued her career into the twilight of the grand ocean liners, the question was no longer whether she would survive the next disaster, but how much longer her body could withstand the internal pressure of being the woman who never broke. The foundation was cracking, hidden behind a professional smile and a lifetime of Irish resolve, setting the stage for a quiet collapse that the world would never see coming. The physical body is a meticulous record keeper of every trauma it has ever endured. For Violet Jessop, the transition into her middle years was marked by a quiet, persistent battle with the remnants of her past. While the public saw a woman of grace and stoic professionalism, her private medical reality was becoming increasingly complex. The most significant, yet often overlooked, injury occurred during the sinking of the Britannic in 1916, when Violet jumped from the sinking ship to avoid being shredded by the propellers. She struck her head against the keel. At the time, she attributed her survival to her thick bundle of auburn hair cushioning the blow. However, years later, a visit to a doctor for chronic, debilitating headaches revealed a shocking truth. She had suffered a compensated skull fracture that had never properly healed. This was not merely a bone injury. It was a traumatic brain injury that had gone untreated for years, likely contributing to the bouts of vertigo and sensory sensitivity that she masked. With her trademark discipline, As the 1920s and 30s progressed, the maritime industry shifted, and so did the demands on Violet's body. The era of the grand, slow-steaming liners was giving way to faster, more vibration-heavy vessels. For a woman who had spent decades on her feet, the physical toll was manifesting in her circulatory system. Chronic venous insufficiency, a common ailment for long-term service staff, began to settle in. Her legs, which had carried her across tilting decks and down into the bowels of sinking ships, were now prone to swelling and pain. Yet the psychological pressure to remain the unsinkable woman meant she rarely sought rest. There is a specific kind of isolation that comes with being a living legend. Violet was expected to be a pillar of strength, a survivor who was immune to the frailties of common people. This expectation created a barrier between her and the medical care she truly required. The 1940s brought the onset of a more insidious decline. The respiratory issues that had nearly claimed her life in Argentina as a child began to resurface in the form of recurring bronchitis and a diminished lung capacity. Modern medical analysis suggests that the primary tuberculosis infection of her youth had likely left significant scarring or fibrosis on her lung tissue. In an era before advanced bronchodilators, every breath became a slightly more conscious effort. This was compounded by the atmospheric conditions of life at sea, the damp, salty air, and the fluctuating temperatures of the North Atlantic. Her heart, tasked with pumping blood through scarred lungs and fighting the effects of long-term survival mode stress, began to show signs of hypertrophy. The constant state of hypervigilance, the startle response that never quite turned off after the Titanic, kept her levels of cortisol and adrenaline higher than the baseline for a woman of her age. Psychologically, the decline was more subtle, but no less profound. Violet lived a life of profound routine, which many trauma survivors use as a coping mechanism to regain a sense of agency over their environment. She was fiercely independent, perhaps to a fault. In 1950, at the age of 63, she finally retired from the sea, settling into a thatched cottage in Great Ashfield. But the transition from the constant hum of a ship's engines to the absolute silence of the English countryside was jarring. Retirement often acts as a catalyst for the manifestation of delayed trauma. Without the distraction of service, the memories of the water, the screams, and the freezing cold likely became more vivid. She turned to gardening and raising chickens, physical labors that kept her body moving but also masked the growing fatigue of a heart that was beginning to struggle. By the late 1960s, the warning signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Violet began to experience episodes of atrial fibrillation, an irregular, often rapid heart rate that can cause poor blood flow. To those around her, she appeared simply to be slowing down with age, but internally, her cardiovascular system was reaching a breaking point. There were documented instances of sudden exhaustion and brief spells of breathlessness that she would dismiss as a touch of the vapors or simple tiredness. She was a woman of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, a generation that viewed complaining about health as a moral failing. This stoicism, while admired by her peers, was medically dangerous. It meant that the early stages of congestive heart failure were never formally diagnosed or managed with the diuretics or digitalis-based medications available at the time. The final years of her life were a study in the contradiction between her public image and her private fragility. She was often interviewed by historians and enthusiasts about the Titanic, forced to relive the most terrifying moments of her life for the sake of the record. Each retelling likely triggered a physiological stress response, a tightening of the chest, a spike in blood pressure. The body does not distinguish between a real threat and a remembered one. Her luck was being exhausted by the very act of remembering it. She was living in a state of compensated heart failure, where the body uses every trick in its manual to keep blood moving. But the margins for error were thinning. The woman who had survived the greatest mechanical, failures of the century was now facing a failure of her own. Biological machinery, a quiet, internal sinking that no lifeboat could prevent. As the winter of 1970 turned into the spring of 1971, those close to her noticed a change in her color, a subtle cyanosis, a bluish tint to the lips and fingernails that signaled her heart was no longer winning the battle against the debt of her past. On the morning of May 5, 1971, the spring air in Great Ashfield was crisp, carrying the scent of the Suffolk gardens Violet Jessop had come to love. When a neighbor, concerned by the unusual lack of activity around the cottage, entered the home, they found the 83-year-old woman in a state of final, undisturbed repose. There was no evidence of a struggle, no sign of the violence that had defined her youth. The woman who had been plunged into the freezing Atlantic and the churning Aegean had passed, away in the warmth of her own bed. Following her discovery, the standard procedures for a sudden death were initiated. Because she had died at home without a physician present in her final moments, a post-mortem examination was necessary to establish the official cause of death, moving her story from the realm of maritime legend into the clinical precision of a medical examiner's suite. The autopsy of Violet Jessop was not a search for foul play, but a documentation of a body that had reached its physiological limit. The medical examiner found a woman whose external appearance belied the internal wear of her 83 years. In the quiet theater of the morgue, the primary finding was clear. Violet had succumbed to congestive heart failure. To the layperson, this often sounds like a sudden event, but medically it is a chronic, progressive condition. Her heart muscle, the myocardium, showed signs of significant thickening and scarring. This was the result of decades of compensation, the heart working harder to pump blood through a system that had been taxed by early tuberculosis and the repeated, extreme surges of adrenaline associated with her 3 shipwrecks. The unsinkable heart had finally dilated, losing its ability to contract with the force required to sustain life. Toxicology reports were unremarkable, ruling out any suggestion of accidental overdose or medicinal mismanagement. There were no traces of the heavy narcotics or sedatives that often haunted the later years of high-stress public figures of her era. Violet had met her end with the same sobriety and clarity with which she had faced the sinking of the Titanic. The examination of her lungs confirmed the ancient scars of her childhood, tuberculosis, calcified nodes that stood as silent witnesses to her first great survival. These scars had likely reduced her pulmonary reserve, placing an even greater burden on her heart as she aged. Furthermore, the old skull fracture from the Britannic, long since fused but still visible as a structural irregularity in the bone, was noted. It served as a final piece of evidence of the sheer physical trauma her frame had absorbed. The official ruling was death by natural causes, specifically heart failure. This clinical conclusion effectively dismantled the tabloid-esque whispers that sometimes surround famous survivors, rumors of survivor's guilt leading to self-harm or hidden addictions. Violet Jessop was not a victim of her own mind. She was a woman whose biological clock had simply run its course after being wound too tightly for too long. The medical truth was far more respectful than the myths. She had lived a full, grueling and ultimately triumphant life, and her body had simply, and quite naturally, worn out. The investigation proved that while the sea had failed to take her, it had certainly shaped the physical landscape of her heart. The legacy Violet Jessop left behind is one that transcends the statistics of the White Star Line. She was more than a witness to history. She was the human face of maritime resilience. Her death marked the end of an era, the passing of one of the last few people who could speak of the Titanic not as a movie or a legend, but as a cold, dark reality. In the years following her passing, her memoirs were published, offering a voice to the silent service class that kept the great liners running. She reminded the world that the Unsinkable moniker was not a supernatural gift, but a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the professional dedication of those who go down to the sea in ships, she became a symbol for the thousands of stewards and crew members whose stories were often drowned out by the names of the millionaires. On the upper decks today, Violet Jessop rests in the churchyard of Great Ashfield alongside her sister. There is no grand monument to the three ships, no dramatic sculpture of waves. There is only a headstone for a woman who lived a quiet life of extraordinary service. When we reflect on her story, we are forced to look at our own capacity for endurance. We see a woman who was dealt a hand of extreme misfortune and played it with a level of grace that feels almost forgotten in the modern age. Her life teaches us that survival is not just about the moment of impact, but about the long, difficult journey of carrying that survival forward. It is about the discipline to keep waking up, keep serving, and keep finding beauty in a garden after seeing the horrors of the abyss. As we close this chapter on the woman who survived the impossible, we are left to wonder about the quiet strength within ourselves. Violet's heart eventually stopped, as all hearts must, but the rhythm of her life continues to inspire those who find themselves in their own metaphorical storms. Her story is a reminder that while we cannot control the waves, we can control how we stand upon the deck. If this deep dive into the medical and human reality of Violet Jessop's life has moved you, we invite you to reflect on her journey in the comments below. How do we measure the cost of resilience? To see more stories that unearth the truth behind history's most enduring figures, please subscribe and join us as we continue to explore the intersection of human life and historical legacy.